you remember Game of Thrones? If I were asking you this question 10 years ago, everybody's answer would have been, oh yeah, I've heard of that one. Even if you don't watch the show, you would have known through cultural osmosis, probably the names of some of the characters or the actors involved. It was a juggernaut, appointment television. It was a myth, a narrative that people had opinions about and conflicting interpretations of. But the reason that I think it was appealing is that it tapped into that tragedy. It felt like a Shakespearean tragedy or a Greek tragedy with very flawed characters who could get some stuff right but were temptable toward things that were very dark. And it dealt with very transcendent themes about the human heart and all of that stuff. It's a very relatable show, also the kind of show that was designed to shock you and stun you with depictions of human depravity. And so the show resonated with a whole bunch of people. I'm not sure I've ever seen a show that has that level of adultiness and also that level of permeating all of culture. It was a very unusual phenomenon. I'm not sure we'll ever see anything like that again. And then the people who made the show turded the bed in the last 2 seasons, and now nobody even cares about it or remembers that it existed because they screwed it up so badly that they wrecked retroactively all of the character motivations and plot arcs and payoffs that were present in the first, 6 seasons that were really, really brilliant. So this is a show that kind of went away from the collective consciousness, and I think we're far enough from it that I can just spoil things. Obviously, there's a disclaimer inherent in here. Like, if you just watch shows that are bad, try to watch things that are good. You make decisions, you'll get it right. I'm sure that wasn't the best disclaimer ever, but you know what I mean. Okay, there's a character in this show, and her name is Daenerys Targaryen. She styles herself as a wrecking ball through the evil institutions of humankind. She's the breaker of chains, the liberator of slaves, and indeed, the institutions that she breaks up, they were pretty bad. Looked like they needed to be broken up. But then as the show goes along, you realize that the hard part of her career was not going to be achieving this big dramatic thing through violence and revolution, but the challenging thing was going to be governing when the dust had settled. That proved to be very difficult for her because she's trying to take a people that's been enslaved and then not enslaved and all over the map politically, and she's trying to unify them and make them into a functioning people group, a functioning nation, and that just isn't easy. You'd think that would be the boring part of the show, but it was surprisingly fascinating to watch her have to labor through that. Likewise, in Nehemiah, it seems like the interesting part of the show here is going to be all of the business about rebuilding a temple and fixing up the walls and all of that's the sexy stuff. It's dramatic. It's even got some violence and some intrigue and some drama to it. And so there's a temptation to let our guard down when we get to the end of chapter 6 and the wall's built and here's all the bad guys and here's all the good guys and we're done. But what we find is that the real task here is just getting started, and that is rebuilding the people. Are you going to do that with a wall? Actually, probably not. All that does is give you a chance. Are you going to do that with a temple? Probably not. The hearts of the people are what makes the temple effective or not effective. You're going to do that by setting up a society, putting leaders in place, and building things in such a way that the people move away from the old mistakes that got them in trouble in the past and toward a clear, unified, cultural, religious, ethical, governmental vision for how things need to be. That task starts now in Nehemiah 7:1. After the wall had been rebuilt and I had set the doors in place, this is Nehemiah writing, the gatekeepers and the singers and the Levites were appointed. Interesting. We're learning something about his priorities here just as we get started in this new chapter. One, you got to build the wall so that you have time to rebuild the people. Okay, makes perfect sense. So he sets the doors. What's the very next thing he does after the final gates are put in place and everything is secured? It's probably president or governor or maybe a treasurer, right? That's what you do next. Nope. Artists. He turns his attention to singers, right? After the wall had been rebuilt and I had set the doors in place, the gatekeepers and the singers and the Levites were appointed. So the gates and the gatekeepers and the walls, that's kind of a package deal. These are the people who are just going to make sure that the doors stay shut and that they're operated the way they need to be. But internally, it's the artists, the singers, who he's most concerned with, or that's what he needs to get right first. Now, I don't think I'm reading between the lines too much to imagine that there was something wrong with the singers before. There had been other people who held sway over the hearts of the returning exiles by singing weird stuff. Now, singing here isn't like pop stars and things like this. Picture, when you think of the singers, something more like singers in a church, a more liturgical, classical, high church kind of setting. Maybe you've been in there before and you hear the singing that somebody sings from up in the balcony, and then people down below might respond to that singing, and somehow they all know the rhythm and the notes. If you've never been around that before, that probably sounded really weird and it wasn't particularly well done. But there's a very ancient artistry to this that goes back not just through the entire era of the Christian church. The Christian church picked up on that style of singing from the singers in the Old Testament. There's music that surrounded the temple, and it's not pop music, it's music that teaches. These singers, they have a celebratory role in worship and all the stuff that happens around the temple. They also have an instructional role. Certain versions of the Christian church would call this like a catechism. They catechize the people through the singing that they do. Well, music is powerful. There's a reason that, for example, protest songs exist. And when you hear one of those Vietnam era protest songs, for example, like there's something happening here, what it is ain't exactly clear. Like, you don't maybe know the details about what's going on in Vietnam. If you're like me, that predates me by a lot, but you can tell, this is somebody who's trying to be reflective about something that they look at as being complete moral absurdity. And the song is designed to kind of undermine the certainty about the war that people during the war might have felt. Here's another perspective. Music and art are very powerful. The music of the 1980s was very subversive in that it was fixated on love and sex and partying and booze and drugs. It was subtle. It was all kind of masked because it needed to stay radio friendly for the most part. But you go back and listen with your adult ears and you hear it. This is subversive. This is driving a wedge between the previous generation and their children. Then you go and listen to this stuff in the 1990s and the music is powerful. It tells a story about disaffected kids, disaffected Gen X kids who have everything in the world in their suburban lifestyles, but they still hate their dads and they feel unsatisfied. I mean, Linkin Park is writing in the late 1990s and early 2000s after 6 or 8 years of the grunge movement, which had mostly burned itself out because there just wasn't much left to throw on a flannel and complain about it. It had all more or less been said in 5 or 6 years. Well, along comes that sort of rap rock kind of style that you get with bands like Linkin Park in the early 2000s. And they are complaining about excess. They're complaining about having too many things. I've become so numb. Everything's so bad. I always have food and a car to drive. What are you even griping about? But that was the music of the generation. That's how we feel. That captures our essence. And then indie rock has its day with bands like Modest Mouse and Conor Oberst. What's his band? Bright Eyes, all of that. Omaha, Saddle Creek Records kind of scene in the mid 2000s up to the early 2010s. There, the vibe was more like, look, we're weird and we're different and you don't know about our thing yet. And this quirky, offbeat individualism is where we find meaning and what sets us apart. But then people started making fun of hipsters and that went away. And then you got a little resurgence into teeny bopper pop music in the early 2010s when Katy Perry and people like that became popular again. But then mainstream music, at least in 2016, fell off a cliff. Go look it up. Nihilism, mumbling, and anger become dominant themes. Now, there's still great music being made since 2016. It's just not popular. Really, very little music is popular at this point. There aren't songs that transcend generations anymore coming out of top 40 music. It just doesn't happen. It's all broken up at this point. Here's what I'm driving at. If anything that I just referenced from the 1960s until right now struck a chord with you, no pun intended, If any of that resonated and you were like, wow, that really was very influential. I remember when that was going on. I remember who that worked on. I remember how it made me feel. I remember how that music sort of wrote the vibe or resonated with the vibe of a generation or a micro generation or a moment in history. If any of that resonated with you, then you understand firsthand through your own experience the power that music has to uphold a narrative, to subvert a narrative, to suggest, to celebrate, to direct people toward an object of worship or an idealization of a set of values or a certain thing to be celebrated. It's powerful, and it should be. Obviously, I'm quite the fan of music, and I don't need to agree with everything about where an artist is coming from to appreciate what they do. But the point is here, Nehemiah is a smart, savvy man. He gets the walls built, appoints gatekeepers, and the first thing he does is direct his attention to the people who are going to be doing the art, specifically the religious musical art, because he wants the right people in place, because he knows that the heart of the people, like the hearts of all people, will be moved by art. The art will reflect them, and they will reflect the art. And right now, Nehemiah is the guy in charge, and he has the ability to set a direction, so he chooses very carefully who's going to be there. He appoints the musicians he wants, and I guarantee you that a dude who's been this meticulous and thoughtful about everything else and who knows what it took to get to this point didn't just be like, all right, who's attractive and has a cool singing voice? Shake the hips there a little bit. Those don't lie. Cool, I pick you, and you, but not you. Your hips are trash. No way. He knew who they were and what they valued and what they thought and what they believed about art and what their art looked like. Even if these aren't people who are the classic singer-songwriter types, he understood the value and the influence of this, and I think he prioritized it very highly. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I don't think I'm reading too much into it. He literally appointed the musicians who lead in the music that point people towards celebration and teaching and valuing things. He appointed them just ahead in the list of the Levites, who we'll talk about next time, who assisted the priests in carrying out their priestly duties. The bigger problem here is not the walls. The bigger problem here is the heart of the people. Go all the way back to the beginning of his quest. Hanani, who now is going to be appointed to be the guy in charge of Jerusalem, he comes back, and what is his report in Nehemiah 1? Those who survived the exile are back in the province, and they're in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. That language got through the armor for Nehemiah. The people are in great trouble and disgrace. Yeah, he's fixing walls, but he's trying to fix the people. And I think it's interesting that the musicians, the artists, the singers are something he prioritizes highly in the service of restoring the people and getting stuff back on track. Sometimes when I mention music in an episode, Jeff then runs out and makes some little Easter egg or homage or something fun. I think I might have overloaded the system with what we just did in this episode. My vote is that we just play the normal outro and go with that, but we'll see what Jeff comes up with. All right, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.